welcome to Just Words, the problem with the language of the other in community service and engagement.
Hi everyone, I'm Susan Harmon. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Experiential Learning at Loyola University Chicago. I coordinate our service learning programs and faculty development programs.
And I'm Megan Berry, also at Loyola University Chicago, serving as the Director of Community Service and Action. Just to kick off our session for today, to give a basic introduction, community engagement on our campuses lies at the intersection of the apostolic preferences of journeying with youth and walking with the excluded. In a time when those at the margins are readily and unduly burdened with the blame for social, political, and economic ills, we are called to a critical review of language in our community engagement work with students. The language of the other is found throughout community-based learning and community service. Perhaps intended to acknowledge the disparity and to inspire authentic response, other can create a deficit-based perspective and subsequent response. Two, it may reinforce a savior mentality that renders fellow human beings as passive objects to be saved rather than as self-determining equals. Another approach emphasizes kinship that can encourage a surface-level view of equality that minimizes the privilege students often hold in their engagement work. A dangerous sense of solidarity can emerge in this approach, where students may mistakenly believe that they grasp the totality of a community's reality and can claim membership in it. Again, objectification may occur as community stories and individual experiences are consumed and perhaps co-opted by students after only brief interactions. In our session today, we aim to unpack this challenge of just words, seeking foremost to raise consciousness of the language we use, to deepen understanding of why we use it, and to commit ourselves to the journey of justice through not only action, but also words. Susan, why don't you unpack?
So using the language of other can be problematic in sometimes really tricky ways. For many of us, we automatically think to making sure that we don't have deficit-based language in our programs. And while that is absolutely essential, right, to talk about the assets and the gifts that the variety of folks that we work with have, othering language can still be problematic and tricky even as we move beyond a simple sort of framework of asset versus deficit-based approach. So to give you a sense of things, here at Loyola University Chicago, we have a really sort of diverse student body. Nearly 45% of our students are students of color, and a very large percentage of them are also first-generation students. And that first-generation identity crosses the color barrier as well. Many of our white-identified students are first-generation, as well as our POC students. So when we talk about language of other in terms of specifically naming or talking about the fact that these communities that we're going to, even as we use asset-based approaches, that they are separate, are other, are different from us, sort of sets up this interesting dynamic in which we are implying that they are definitively separate from Loyola. To a certain extent, then they don't belong at Loyola if we're not careful. And that puts students who grew up in many of these neighborhoods in this very strange place where they're essentially being told that they don't have a place here. They're separate from, which is important to recognize, but they're definitively separated from. There's no way seemingly for us to bridge that gap. Now, the other alternative then is just to say, all right, we won't use the term at all. Let's step away from that. Let's break down those barriers. But then what happens when we really don't acknowledge those really essential differences? Then all of a sudden we've taken out any capacity or ability to talk about privilege, to talk about very real difference that alters and changes the way in which folks move throughout their days and life. And in particularly around community engagement and community service work, acknowledging these differences and learning from them is an essential part of, I would argue, Ignatian education in and of itself. So where we find ourselves is sort of stuck between these really quite difficult poles that we have to try to move between. And I've sort of termed these the poles of cheap recognition and cheap solidarity. Two bits of terminology that I've come up with that I'd like to sort of walk you through to invite you to think about how your programs might be approaching them as well. So I get this terminology of cheap specifically from the work of theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He talks about something called cheap grace in his work, The Cost of Discipleship. And it specifically talks about this experience of the grace of God's love that doesn't spur any sacrifice, any discomfort in the recipient. Essentially, it's this idea of I'm saved, so therefore I don't need to do anything or worry about it. It's the acceptance of a faith that then doesn't in any way, shape, or form equal or move forward into a form of discipleship. And he contrasted this specifically to the idea of costly grace. That's that same grace that we experience, but sparks in its recipient an unending life of discipleship that focuses not on the sort of repayment of a debt that could receive no satisfaction, but instead on a lifetime orientation towards striving for and doing the work of God. So using that language of cheap versus costly, I'd like to present to you all these ideas of, again, cheap recognition and cheap solidarity, and contrast them with a framework of costly recognition and costly solidarity. So cheap recognition. So this is born, I think, for many of us out of the desire to show participants in our programs that there are other people who live very different from them, right? We want to recognize in the ways and spaces in which their life experience, our students, is not the standard. So we want to show them other ways of living to get them to recognize these things. We want to get students to truly know what it's like to be someone else. However, cheap recognition can manifest when little thought is given to how these activities are often problematic and how they don't engage any conception of privilege, or in how they appear to marginalized communities. Students get to see another reality and they conclude that it's something to be avoided. If you think about it, the idea of #blessed, right, is a perfect encapsulation to a certain extent of cheap recognition. Or a student who reflects upon their work potentially at a local soup kitchen saying, man, well, it really, taught me to realize how grateful I am that I had food growing up. But that's the extent of it. There's no thoughts about structure. There's nothing else. All they know is that they're different and that that's important. So I want to contrast that cheap recognition to the idea of a costly recognition. Political philosopher and theorist Iris Marion Young speaks of the importance of recognition and acknowledging the existence of others as an essential aspect of justice. But for Young, that simple acknowledgement that another person exists and does so in a way that's not identical to the prevailing experience of those in power is not enough to move us towards justice. Recognition has to be linked to participation in order for justice to flourish. Justice requires the active structuring of society in such a way that everyone is interacting with one another as peers. A student who walks away from service expressing gratitude that they're not born worse off economically has recognized, quote unquote, the existence of others, but they certainly don't believe that that person is a peer. To be peers might mean that a student would need to consider how they're interrelated, how their own actions and choices impact the lives of the folks that they just interacted with and served. Justice requires that we see and recognize the other person as being a needed part of society, even in their difference to us, and doing everything possible to aid in their full participation in society, because their experiences, their different way of moving through the world is going to be essential for us to build the kingdom that we want. It's not enough to know that poverty exists. Recognition should call us to see where structures have left others at the margins, either by neglect or other forms. So on the other side of this coin of cheap recognition, if we move away to try to avoid that, we might find ourselves in the space of cheap solidarity. So the language of solidarity can sort of imply that these temporary experiences that students have, as, again, informative and educational as they can be, somehow that they can allow students to fully and completely understand the lived reality of the marginalized communities that they might be interacting with. That somehow, whether it's an immersion experience or even on a regular basis volunteering someplace, by doing so, they now understand definitively and all the way through the experience of someone else. They are in kinship with them, right? There's no difference between them. They've reached out and now they're able to bridge the void, and we're all able to live in harmony. And we don't need to talk about pesky things like privilege, right? About difference. About the ways in which our own racialized identities mean that our experience of the world looks different. Solidarity becomes a way for students to avoid having discussions of privilege in their own life. Cheap solidarity implies that privilege is something simply a privileged person can just ignore or opt out of. You can just sort of put it down and walk away from. It's a simple choice to fully understand oppressed communities. You just have to decide you want to do it. And it's an understanding that can be gained in some cases in under a week. Now, the alternative to that is an understanding and framework of costly solidarity. This reframing to move away from sort of a hollow echo of solidarity that's just sort of this messy leveling out that wants us to all sort of claim that we're one together to move forward and to not get in those pesky arguments that comes up when we talk about things like racism or structural inequality, is moving us more towards the understanding that solidarity needs to be a process. Theologian James Minkhouse talks a lot about solidarity as a journey, and he specifically uses the image of a geometric phenomenon called an asymptote. It's this idea that it is this point in a horizon that no matter how close you think you get to it, it's always just beyond it. He specifically says solidarity can be understood in this way because we can never become the other. But to speak of the importance of growing in solidarity with another person speaks to the importance of process and growth. Even though an individual is never going to be able to fully achieve solidarity in the sense that they'll never fully know or subsume the other, right? We want to avoid making the folks that we're in these relationships with something that can be consumed. Minkhouse says that solidarity is the pursuit of something that will lead to growth. And it has to be seen as a lifelong process that can be sparked by our programs. But at the end of the day, it's just the beginning of a lifelong commitment. So theory is all well and good, catchphrases are great, but at the end of the day, if we can't see and recognize how it shows up in our work, it's not really very much good or use to us. So on that note, I would like to flip it over to Megan to talk specifically about how this might show up in our work on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Right, so as we think about our language, we need to consider our students, whether they are high school students or college students. Certainly in my experience with Loyola students here in Chicago, they are in such an exciting and confusing exploration of an emerging sense of self. So this question of relating to peer is complicated, of course, because they're seeking a personal sense of autonomy, a sense of power, a sense of responsibility beyond themselves and within themselves. They also have an emerging sense of the world around them, whether that view of the world be very small and close to a literal or metaphorical home, or if it's something much bigger, a broader, larger understanding of the world. But our students are doing that. They're confused and excited and trying to understand themselves in the world. In that process, I find that students often find comfort in clear, distinct rules or beliefs in the ways that the world works. This then means that they may find discomfort in sitting somewhere in the middle, or in daring to explore the things that they don't agree with, or more likely to explore the things that they simply don't know in any real way. I think that this parallel or this split between comfort and discomfort can often then lead to students leading disintegrated or compartmentalized lives, where I do this thing here, I live this way here. Along those lines, in the work that I do with engaging students in local community service and some justice and advocacy programs, I often ask them to define service in different ways. And most often, at least in a starting point with our students, they prioritize physical presence, relationships, tangible contributions, helping, and perceived immediate and positive impact of the work. As they move along, often their experiences, learning, reflections deepen, and I begin to hear about some sense of benefit to self or mutuality, some value of presence over product, an awareness of possible negative impacts of work, and the actual voice of the folks with whom they are working. Clearly, wherever I'm meeting a student, their responses to what is service, what is community engagement, these responses are clearly impacted by their circle of social influence: family, friends, school, worship communities, civic groups. They're also highly influenced by personal experience, both in their lives, both on campus and off, and in their personal experience through community engagement opportunities. Along those lines, I'll note that for many of the students who are first coming to us, their introduction to community engagement came through a requirement where they entered the service with a self-understanding of student and with there being an end product or end result or simply an ending point of that engagement. So the starting point that my office often has with students is that they are poised to benefit from contact with people and circumstances that they don't know in any real lived way. I'm sure that many of us can hear the echoes of Kolvenbach's call for students to experience the gritty reality of the world so that they can critically and constructively respond to injustice. Certainly there is great value in that. But the approach cannot escape two persistent questions, I would say. First, how do we speak about the human beings with whom we are connecting our students? And how is the voice of those people present in our engagement? Essentially, are we unwittingly engaging in either the cheap solidarity or in the cheap recognition that Susan has begun to unpack for us? For the language that we use in my work at Loyola, most often we choose the language of the organization with whom we partner. Guest, resident, client, member, neighbor. Clearly words that are a distinction. I don't know that our students would necessarily connect with any of those words. They would connect with student, really, is what I think they would connect with. In using that language from those organizations, we make a goodwill assumption that the labels are guided by the interests and preferences of those whom the organization serve. But what do our students hear when we use these words? Are they drawing distinctions rather than connections? How are students' understanding of the other influenced by this language and by the assumptions that we bring behind it? How are students' understandings of self shaped at the same time? Are we calling them to true or to cheap solidarity, to true or to cheap recognition? I just had a conversation with some students that came to mind as I was thinking through this conversation with Susan. And so I want to pose a question or share a question that I posed with students that I think ended up being a pretty interesting touchstone for me on this significant question. So we had a group of student leaders who were sharing their community engagement experience with peers, trying to encourage them to do community engagement themselves. And some context here is that the work that we engage our students in is prioritized around connections with organizations close to campus. This means that students readily can see people they know from their sites, on the bus or the train, at the grocery store, or just out and about. So as our students were presenting this information and their experiences to their peers, I tossed a question out, which was, what do you do when you see someone you know from your service commitment away from the service site? It was a hard question for the student leaders to answer. Maybe from lack of self-awareness or from having given the question any consideration. Maybe there was some discomfort for them with the question, not really sure. But regardless, it definitely seemed that most of them hadn't considered the question before and were uncomfortable. To be clear, I wasn't looking for a particular answer. And in fact, I don't think that there is only one appropriate way to respond in that situation. But it struck me that their response aligned with the compartmentalized way many students, and heck, many of us non-students live. It seemed that I uncovered some fertile ground for reflection and awareness that connects with the question of how we speak of others in our lives and then how we really understand them. Definitely a connection to this idea of cheap recognition or cheap solidarity. So as we continue to open up this difficult question of just words, Susan is going to come back in, and why don't you go ahead, Susan, and maybe suggest some alternative ways of understanding the other and self in community engagement.
Great, Megan. I'll do just that. So we presented you with these sort of two dangerous poles, right? Not giving you a solid answer of which way to go, knowing too that your context is probably potentially very different from ours at Loyola. But I did want to share with you all a framing of an understanding of the word other that I think might be helpful, potentially in approaching this. Well, unfortunately not giving you the quick fix it that you might have been hoping for by the end of this video. So I'd love to introduce you to the work of a philosopher by the name of Emmanuel Levinas. And for Emmanuel Levinas, he said that existence itself begins with relationship. We don't exist outside of the relationship in which we are in. He said the best existence, or best description of what it actually means to exist in the world and to be, is being situated in a relationship to another person with whom one is in proximity. And he calls this person to whom we're in proximity to, this person who arguably he claims gives us existence in and of itself, he calls the other. And this other is absolutely essential, right? We don't exist outside of them. Everyone is other to us, and we are other to someone else that we're in relationship to. What's really interesting is the proximity of another person, right? Not only sort of literally brings us into existence, but it places a demand upon us, places a demand on the subject that can't be ignored and actually happens often before we're even aware of it. So the other not only makes us who we are, but their call, their existence in the world, their needs, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, is something that none of us can ignore. And it exists even before we choose sometimes to see it or become aware of it. Us becoming aware of this thing doesn't necessarily bring it into existence, but rather it calls us into existence instead. It was beyond recognition, right? Levinas believed that who you are is completely constituted by the other. You don't exist beyond them. And he argued that understanding your responsibility and justice has to be oriented as coming not from you and from your inborn moral sentiments, your sense of righteousness, your faith, your belief, your righteousness, but by the interruptions of another person, or maybe more charitably understood, your relationship to another person. It can't be avoided. It can't be stepped around. And at the end of the day, it makes you who you are. So there's no sort of magic correct place in which to put language of other, because someone is constantly other to us. We are other to someone else. However, that doesn't mean somehow that we are definitively separate from one another in a way that puts a barrier. In fact, without them, we couldn't be who we are. We couldn't exist as we know it. But we cannot for an instant conflate our existence with them. They're not the same. They're other to us. But their needs, their hopes, their relation to us shapes the way that we need to interact in the world. It reminds me a little bit of something that Gustavo Gutierrez, a liberation theologian, used to say, that for us, in order to stand straight according to the gospel, we always have to locate our center of gravity outside of ourselves. So taking that language, right, it's not an easy fix. It doesn't clearly sort of resolve things one way or the other, but perhaps it gives us a sense of how we can relate to this understanding of engaging with someone that we know we can't sort of simplify down as to just a brother and sister in Christ, because there's so much more than that. And yet, at the same time, we cannot completely shove away as being totally apart and separate from us instead. So knowing that we haven't really presented you with an easy fix to that language of other that you might be find floating around your department pages or your learning outcomes or any of the language that you give your students, we want to invite you to maybe just undertake this practice. Take a look at the language that you use. Dig into it and ask yourself, do you tend to shift more towards a pole that could get a little close to cheap recognition, or is it a pole that shifts closer to cheap solidarity? There's no right or wrong answer, and we know that context is going to affect that. But do you know why you chose that language? Have you been intentional about it? Have you thought about that? And are you aware of the challenges that, again, emerge from using it? It's our hope that just even those questions themselves might help you in refining down how you want to talk to your students, how you want to talk to the folks that you work with. But at the end of the day, constantly and continuing reflecting on the language that we use when we engage with other people, particularly in the essential, very problematic, and very sensitive work, community engagement and community service. We also want to invite you all, we're holding a breakout session, so feel free to join us there live, if you will, closest thing to in person we can get in COVID-19, to talk that through. And if you can't make it to a breakout session, I don't want to speak for you, Megan, but I'm always happy to be in conversation as well.
Same for me. Just interesting conversation. I think we are all on this journey of learning to do this as best we can every day.
Thanks for your time. Look forward to hopefully being in more conversation with you all, and have a great day.